Hello and welcome to this Big Finish review. Today we're going to be continuing the trend of building towards the 60th anniversary by looking at Big Finish's second adaptation of a Doctor Who story written by Davies, which was actually the first Doctor Who script that he ever produced. But before we get into it, I'd just like to ask, if you haven't already, please support the channel by hitting subscribe, turning on notifications, liking and commenting, and you can find and follow me on social media at the links here. Something I have to clarify also is that this isn't going to be a conventional review, as the second half is going to be going into a pretty different direction where I discuss my thoughts on Rusty Davies as a writer, specifically related to his Doctor Who content, and relate it back to the main subject, that being Mind of the Hodiac, originally written by Rusty Davies, but co-written and adapted by Scott Hancock. When I say this was his first script, that technically isn't true, as this is more of a fan script that he was working on in the 80s, which never really went past the first draft for part 1 and a brief outline for part 2. He did submit some scripts a few years later under the Andrew Cartmel run, but by the time he did, the show had gone on the indefinite hiatus. He found this script back in 2021 while working on a separate project, and during an interview he discussed it, and inevitably Big Finish decided to get hold of the adaptation, and Russell worked with Scott Hancock to bring it to life. The plot sees a mysterious creature known as the Hodiac taking control of a intergalactic stock market, as well as forcing the Doctor, Mel, and a ordinary British family to be caught in the middle of his plan to hunt down the other side of his personality. As it turns out, the Hodiac is two separate entities, and this version wishes to bring the two of them together.
The other is out there, actively aware. She knows that I am searching and is afraid. She's out there, somewhere in the wide worlds.
It's gone. Whatever it was, it's gone.
But couldn't you feel it? The strength of it? A mind, a magnificent mind.
Is that it? It's over!
No, it is far from over.
The battle lines have been drawn. We march upon the earth.
When it comes to the adaptation of Mind of the Hodiac, I cannot deny just how much positive impact this release ended up having for not only for Russell T Davies but the Doctor Who brand in general, as it likely played a part in Davies being in the mindset to return as showrunner, but it also led to Scott Hancock getting a job working on the new era with Russell. Where this release does fall apart though is its story, as you can definitely feel the amateurish nature that comes from a fan script. There has been some updates in the adaptation process, but I definitely feel, at least for part 1, there are a lot of elements in the story which don't really end up going anywhere, and when you listen to the behind the scenes discussions about this story, you can definitely tell how much Russell put a lot of his own personal feelings into it, but it didn't really end up going anywhere. For example, there are some nice elements initially with the Sixth Doctor and how he discusses Wind in the Willows and is compared to Mr. Toad. I think that's quite nice.
What's that you're reading? What weighty tome is fit for this hour of contemplation? The law of planetary motion, the latest on string theory, the Wind in the Willows? Oh, come on.
What's wrong with it?
Well, nothing. Not at the right age. Anyway, I won't intrude. Maybe I can find a copy of Grimm's Fairy Tales lying around.
It does no harm to keep in touch with a little magic.
But then that just becomes sort of like the Doctor's de facto method of communicating, just randomly quoting Wind of the Willows for no real reason in part 1. And another example is the evil space stock market plot, where Russell admits that the main reason he wrote it was being mad at the stock market for some reason back in the 80s, and he can't really remember why now. That plot mainly exists as a point to just raise funds for the villain's plan to hire some mercenaries. And when we get to part 2, both the Wind in the Willows dialogue and this organisation just end up being cut completely from the story. There is a nice bookend for the Sixth Doctor's obsession with Wind in the Willows that comes at the very end of the story, but for the most part I think dropping it was the right move. I do think an issue with this story is trying to emulate the 45-minute format of season 22 and continuing the production misunderstanding that part 1 should be treated like the first 2 episodes rather than just 1 episode, which a lot of writers during that season made that mistake, which led to the story just kind of meandering and stretching itself quite thin, meaning that the story is already halfway done before the Doctor really gets involved in the main story. With this adventure, basically all the major plot elements, I think they're well established by the 30-minute mark of the plot, about halfway through part 1, so it just feels a bit stretched out before they actually start making active changes to the story, and we just kind of wait for the story to get started again now that everything's been set up. Once part 2 gets going, all of those issues are fixed. I don't know whether it's a fact that part 2 is just better, or because that part is mostly Scott Hancock's original work based on the notes, but I will concede that part 2 is easily the stronger part, and we get some pretty nice sequences. For instance, the Sixth Doctor getting to interact with the female incarnation of the Hodiac, that is a pretty good highlight. However, it's hard to get mad at this story for its issues, as it was never intended to be a proper Doctor Who story. Given a few additional drafts to better tidy things up, I think it would have been improved significantly, and you can definitely tell how much Russell is really passionate about the things he's talking about. It's interesting to look at it and see how all the way back in the 80s, so many of his ideas that ended up cropping into his version of the show were already in his mind at the time. It is so interesting to see how many things were planned ahead, and it really put a lot of things into perspective for me and gave me a better understanding of Russell's mindset, which I think serves as a good segue into the second half of the video. One major thing I learned, thanks to this story, was understanding my issues regarding modern Doctor Who, in particular the seasons after Rusty Davies left the show. You can definitely tell in his run Russell had a formula, and looking at these stories you can clearly tell that these are ideas and themes and character types, and you can definitely tell just how passionate he cared about these particular ideas. Of course, compromises had to be made, and there was definitely a lot of behind the scenes issues in his run, but ultimately I think the final product very much reflects the desired goal Russell wanted to make for his vision of Doctor Who. I feel this and Damaged Goods really put into perspective just how much of Russell's era was planned ahead of time and With that said, I do think it has kind of outstayed its welcome post Russell's departure, and I do wish the other showrunners moved away from it a lot more, and rather than having it be an intentional creative decision, it just feels like the permanent status quo. I do like Russell's formula. When it works, it's produced some of the best Doctor Who content we've ever gotten in the entire show. My point is that ultimately, I think it's ready to not be retired, but at least given a break for the time being. It made me understand why I don't like some elements of the Moffat era and Chibnall era as much, because it does feel on occasion that they're going through the motions and reusing a lot of elements that you found in the Russell era, which I understand why they worked in the past, but since they aren't their vision, they aren't their version of Doctor Who, I don't think it worked as well, and it's why I'm getting a bit tired of a lot of these formats. And my biggest hope with Russell coming back is that less that he's trying to remake his old era and try and bring Series 4 back to life or whatever. I hope that he's a bit more creative and brings out all those story ideas like Midnight and Turn Left that he was a bit too nervous to make, as they veered away from the more general audience friendly series he was trying to make and didn't really want to alienate them. I think back in the early 2000s it made sense, but now I think Doctor Who's ready to shake its formula up a little bit more. I hope you enjoyed this video, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.